getting back now to the series between wars, post-war. We're going to start looking at a different author this week. So it's been quite a while looking at some of the books written by Albert Camus, and now we're going to look at Jean-Paul Sartre. So the two of them kind of tend to go together. They were both writing just before and during and just after the Second World War, and they both had important reputations, I suppose, in France and also in what you might call the intellectual world generally, I guess, around that time. Probably less so now than then, but although I think people still do read them. And in particular, they were both associated with this big idea that we talked about before, existentialism, which is, they were probably the leading proponents of that in their day. So Jean-Paul Sartre, like Albert Camus, wrote some novels, fictional works, and I think plays as well, but also wrote just straightforward philosophical treatises, more so particularly in Sartre's case because he was actually a lecturer in philosophy at the university in Paris. So that was his profession, I suppose, as well as his interest. So when we were looking at Camus, we mentioned the Myth of Sisyphus, which is one of the books where he actually set out his ideas in a more direct, reasoned way, I suppose, whereas in some of the novels he alluded to them and the same ideas came through. So it's the same thing with Sartre, of course. So he wrote a number of novels, one called Nausea, which we'll look at later in next week or two, which again that more clearly sets out his ideas in a way that you can easily discern from because he says it more or less literally in some ways what he's talking about. But then there's a trilogy of novels called The Age of Reason, The Reprieve and Iron in the Soul, which are fictional works talking about a group of characters living in France just before the outbreak of the Second World War and then into the early years of the Second World War. And so it's a fictional work, but a lot of those same ideas are brought out in it. And then he wrote, as I said, some heavy philosophical works. So I've read those novels. I haven't read his actual philosophical works, and I'm not sure if I could cope with those really. But anyway, I haven't read them. But I've read a couple of his other books. So then the question then arises: well, are you entitled to talk about a writer if you've only read some of his books? And someone actually asked me that once. I remember someone saying, well, how can anyone claim to really understand much about a particular writer? If you'd only read one of his books, for example, then you really don't know much about him, you only know one aspect to him. And at the time, I think I thought that was probably right. I agreed with him about that then, but that was a long time ago. But on reflection now, and having read a lot more of various writers since then, and a lot of books by individual writers, I actually think the opposite now, really, that if you have read one book by an author and read it thoroughly and really tried to understand it as you were reading it, you probably do in some ways know as much about that writer as you're ever going to, even if you read a lot of her other books. Because basically I think most writers, novelists and philosophical writers keep writing and saying the same thing over and over again, more or less, with variations, of course, but basically when you look at it, they tend to be making the same points and expressing the same viewpoints on the world and their experience of the world. There may be some developments and changes, sometimes complete revisions and reversals of points of view, but even then, the same underlying view of things seems to come through. So I think that's true of certainly of what you might call more commercial books, as well as I suppose what one might call more kind of serious books. So if you think of books in a particular genre, say detective stories like whodunits or war stories or cowboy stories or Mills and Boon kind of romances, they have the same plot lines, and people expect them to. They want those things to appear, the same kind of dilemmas and the same resolutions of those dilemmas. And the people that read them want the same thing when they pick up another book by the same author. That's what they're looking for, and they'd be disappointed if they didn't find it. So there's enough of a variation to make it still entertaining. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, so you still want to read the book to find out, but you know ultimately what's going to happen, particularly in the case of romances, but in whodunits and things as well. So it's expected that the author keeps following the same general outline and structure of the book, and it's intended to be that way. But in books that are supposedly written by people who are really trying to express their experience of life and the world and everything, you might think that wouldn't be so, that they wouldn't kind of follow that established outline. But I think they do, really. So, for example, I like Anthony Trollope, a 19th century English novelist. I've read a lot of his books, and they're always very entertaining, and they're well worth reading. They're quite long books, some of them. But when you step back and look at them, they're all very much basically the same. They have the same kind of characters in the same social milieu, either in the political world or the church world. They have the same kind of moral dilemmas that they face. They're all looking for a prospective mate, or not all, but that's what's one of the main plot lines, is someone looking for a prospective mate that you can love and marry, but at the same time gain some advantage in the relationship as well. So those things happen in all of those novels. You still want to read them because they're different enough from each other to make it interesting. So I actually wrote a fair bit and quoted a fair bit of Trollope and Thackeray, who are both, I suppose, my heroes of 19th century English novels, in my book called Best of Times, Worst of Times, and also quite a lot about Dickens, and I think with Dickens I would say that the same thing applies, that he keeps on expressing the same sort of ideas in those novels, although a lot of people might disagree with that, but I find a particular view of the world and human beings in Dickens that is repeated all through those novels, which I really don't like. So he's kind of the villain, in a way, of my book, Best of Times, Worst of Times. So this is a bit of a digression from what we're supposed to be talking about, but the idea of whether an author continually says and writes the same thing over and over again, so you really only need to read one of his or her books to have a pretty good understanding of them. I think the same thing applies in 20th century fiction. So this particular Graham Greene, and again in another of my books, Beards and Funny Hats, I devoted a whole chapter to him, and the fact that he keeps on saying the same thing. And so if you read lots of his novels, I've read I think just about all of his novels, and they almost all come back to the same issue. There's a man, and I think one could not be blamed for seeing the man as largely a representation of the author himself, who is kind of an urbane, somewhat world-weary, experienced man. Wherever he goes, he seems to find himself in a situation where he's attracted to a young woman, or a young woman is attracted to him, and he's not able to resist the temptation to get into a relationship with her, even though that's going to cause betrayal of his wife, if he has one, or betrayal of that woman's husband, And sometimes that betrayal will actually take the form of not just adultery, but even of murder sometimes, or of suicide, or both. And that, so you can find that in a lot of his novels. For example, The Quiet American and The Heart of the Matter, that it comes to that point. But always the sense of betrayal. And beyond that too, he makes makes a lot out of the fact that he suffers a great deal of angst because in involving himself in that adulterous relationship, he's actually seemingly betraying his own Catholic faith that he's adopted. And this is something we should look at actually in this Between Wars, Post-War. I hadn't really thought of that before, but both Graham Greene and a contemporary English novelist of his, Evelyn Waugh, quite different from what we've been looking at, Sartre and Camus, who put forward this idea of existentialism. Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene both made this big point out of converting to Catholicism in the midst of a culture, early to mid 20th century England, where, as in France, atheism was more or less the accepted position of anyone that had any pretensions to be an intellectual or be a literary person. They both made a big deal out of actually converting to Catholicism. They weren't born into it. They deliberately chose to become Catholics, and that forms a large part of their books. So particularly Graham Greene makes this big develops this idea that he can't resist entering into this relationship because he feels this love for this woman, but at the same time he feels this love for God, and that creates this terrible conflict in him. Who does he love more? And the love for one causes him to seemingly betray the other, or vice versa. Anyway, so I wrote a big chapter about that and went into a lot more detail about it. There's a lot of quotations. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make at the moment is all the books are pretty much the same, and he's developing that same theme through all of them. Anyway, this has all been a bit of a digression, so we'll get back properly to look at something by Sartre in next week's episode.